It is early summer in 972, and two forces gather at the borders of the young Piast state. Acting on his own initiative, Odo, Margrave of the Ostmark, descends upon a crossing of the Oder River, his intent to bring war to the upstart Poles, whose expansion into western Pomerania has become an intolerable reality. Yet Duke Mieszko I has not been inactive, and intelligence of Odo's approach gives him ample time to muster a response. After taking counsel with his leading men, he decides to confront Odo near the Piast stronghold of Cedynia. Here, perhaps his hopes for continued independence from direct imperial rule would live or die. Near to the crossing, Mieszko's men met the invaders, and a fierce melee ensued. Odo perhaps couldn't help but admire the tenacity of his foes, but is then unsurprised when they tire, falter, and then begin to melt away. A few knights scoff at the retreat. The backs of their enemies are a welcome sight, and now the invaders form up to take the fight further into Mieszko's domain. Odo and his army must have been in high spirits as the column marched on. Just yonder lay the Piast stronghold of Cedynia. Would this be the first to fall in a larger war of conquest? Only time would tell in this pivotal battle in Polish history. Okay, here it is, the book. But it's not just any book, it's a quest. Hiding in these pages are puzzles, but you have to know where to look. Butterflies like this one are not just pretty illustrations, they're clues to entry-level puzzles. But the butterflies are just the beginning. The book contains many more hidden puzzles. And there is a secret website, but you'll need to uncover its address. Only 7 people in the world have solved it completely. No joke. But you could be number 8 if you look closely enough. This is the book, the ultimate guide to rebuilding a civilization made by hungry minds. I am not at all surprised that this book is a global bestseller. It is a captivating, illustrated encyclopedia of humankind's greatest inventions and discoveries, with over 400 pages and 180 topics of unique illustrations that blend history, science, art, and design. The combination of engineering drawings and medieval art style, all done on premium matte art paper and laminated hardcover, truly make this book a pleasure to hold. For those of you who want to spark your curiosity or are looking for a perfect gift for curious friends and colleagues, check out the book using my link below or scan the QR code on screen. Hungry Minds is offering a special discount, so a big thank you to them. The origins of the Polish Piast dynasty are shrouded in legend and a fog of history. According to the chronicler Gallus Anonymous, their rule was rooted in an act of kindness and hospitality. The legendary Piast the wheelwright taking in 2 angelic strangers at his son's coming-of-age feast. This was rewarded, the strangers casting a spell that made Piast's cellar ever plentiful, and Piast himself popular with the people. Elected duke by the people on the death of the previous ruler, Piast forewent the title in favor of his son, Przemyslids, who became the first Piast duke of the Polands. His great-grandson Mieszko I emerged fully into the light of history as duke by the middle of the 10th century, his ancestors having carved out a realm. Virtually nothing is known about Mieszko's early life for sure. As the son of Przemysl, Gallus relates how from birth to his 7th year the future duke was blind. At the gathering of his coming-of-age feast, Mieszko's father lamented his son's condition, but was then told by his wife how the boy could now see, joyfully demonstrating this to all. Gallus further explains how Przemysl then consulted the wise men and elders present, and they foresaw that the boy would accomplish great things, as his recovery mirrored Poland's own blindness. but that through him the nation too could come to new sight, and would be raised above others and be granted enlightenment. Though details on his earlier military exploits are scarce, Mieszko likely spent much of his youth fighting to extend his realm's borders under his father Przemysl. Shortly after his accession in 963, Mieszko faced off against the Valleti, a West Slavic group of peoples who, allied with the Přemyslids to the south, posed an existential threat to his domain. Luckily for the Polish Duke, the Czechs did not aid their allies, otherwise events may have turned out very differently. 2 years later, Mieszko made a decisive diplomatic move in forging his own alliance with the Czechs, marrying the daughter of Boleslav I the Cruel, Dobrava. According to contemporary accounts, it was Mieszko's new bride who persuaded him to convert to Christianity, though this may have been a condition of his alliance with her father. Whatever the case, the Polish Duke's conversion was a wise move in the long run, granting him equality among the Christian princes and some measure of protection as he advanced his own interests. One effect of his new faith was to bind his own people closer to him. Before his conversion, the various religious centers of his realm always had the potential of developing rival centers of power to his own. A Christian ruler, in natural opposition to this, was accepted as the legitimate anointed monarch, blessed by God, and therefore this had a natural unifying effect on cementing Mieszko's own position within his domain. His people by and large converted to the new faith, some requiring persuasion, and while pockets of paganism would persist for decades, this period would generally see the coming of Mieszko's folk into the Christian fold. Diplomatic efforts would prove wise. In 967 he met the invading army of the Valleti and Volhynians under the Saxon Wichman. Whilst the precise route of invasion and the location of the battle are uncertain, Mieszko's intelligence was good, and thus enabled him to muster around 3,000 men to meet them. The Družina would have undoubtedly formed the core of his response. However, not every man of this elite could be gathered for the fight. The most important and intimate men would indeed accompany Mieszko on his campaigns, though this true elite would perhaps have numbered in the hundreds and included his most trusted friends and advisors. The outer group, meanwhile, would still be needed to man the many strongholds, sometimes far from major population concentrations, the better to maintain control and levy taxes. The bulk of Mieszko's forces would have been composed of militias, not only peasants and serfs, but also men from the larger settlements of Mieszko's domain. The vast majority of these fighting men would have been infantry, and would have been expected to arm themselves. In addition to their part-time status as warriors, this naturally meant that they were relatively poorly armed compared to more seasoned opponents, and perhaps lacked experience and discipline. Despite their faults, however, Mieszko's part-time warriors would prove their opponents equal in courage. Crucially, in the clash to come, Mieszko could also boast the assistance of his new Czech allies, who sent several hundred cavalry. In opposition, Wichman's pagan army numbered anywhere between 3,000 and 6,000 men, and seemingly held all the cards, fielding larger numbers and arguably better quality men. The Saxon leader deployed his forces in a tight shield wall, with his fortified camp at his back, the better to deal with the poorer quality Polish infantry. Meanwhile, Mieszko drew up his infantry. Their role was to invite the wrath of the pagans, to lure them away from the protection of their camp. Indeed, deception was hardly required, as the Polish warriors were hard-pressed once Wichman's attack was underway, and yet they fought ferociously, inflicting as heavy a death toll as they received, whilst being gradually pushed back. All the while, Duke Mieszko observed events on a nearby hill. Patience and nerve must have been the watchwords of the day, as only once Wichmann's army had been sufficiently drawn away from the safety of their camp was the signal given to counterattack. Mieszko and his hidden cavalry streamed into sight, whilst the battered Polish infantry dug in their heels and countercharged. Mieszko's warriors attacked the pagan flanks and rear in what must have come as a total shock to the aggressors. Once the maneuver was complete and a full encirclement achieved, the battle devolved into little more than a slaughter. Admirably, the Valleti, as was their fashion, initially refused to lay down their arms, trusting to their gods to deliver them the triumph. They also compelled their commander to dismount and remain, though all this achieved was a bloodier defeat. Given the encirclement, few broke away or eluded the pursuing Polish and Czech cavalry. One initial survivor was Wichmann himself. However, his hours were numbered, as he was found and killed soon after. The defeat of the Valleti-Volhynian alliance revealed Mieszko as a commander of considerable talent. The impressive coordination and discipline required of both his cavalry and infantry achieved a decisive victory, and it was such tactics that would later prove crucial in his later struggles. In 919, the Ottonian dynasty arose to power in East Francia. Having been elected at the suggestion of the dying king Conrad I, Henry the Fowler took little time to consolidate his rule, forcing the acknowledgement of the Dukes of Swabia and then Bavaria. Henry did much to secure the kingdom, fighting the invading Magyars, whilst expanding the German domain into Lotharingia and later to the north. Henry, no stranger to fighting the Palabian Slav tribes to the east, also subdued the region in a series of campaigns, though German rule there was hardly harmonious. 2 years before Mieszko's triumph over Wichmann, the great German lord Gero died. Gero had overseen the vast Marca Geronis, or March of Gero, in the region that stretched from the Baltic coast to the borders of the Přemyslids. The last few decades had witnessed various bloody campaigns against the Palabian Slavs that inhabited the area. Though by no means completely pacified, by Gero's final campaign against the Lusatians in 963, this supermarch was certainly stable enough for Henry's successor, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, to break it up into various smaller domains. 2 marches in particular were especially important in the context of Germano-Polish relations: the Nordmarch, or North March, under Dietrich, and the Ostmarch, or East March, under a relative of Gero, the Margrave Odo I. Though the Saxon chronicler Thietmar described Dietrich as a prince, perhaps holding authority even over other margraves, Odo too is held in some regard, called famous, noble and distinguished, which suggests a certain intimacy with Emperor Otto himself. The question of exactly why Odo decided to strike at Mieszko's domain has been a subject of debate over the millennium since the battle. One likely casus belli for Odo were the simple interests of his own domain and the German realm in general. Though formally loyal to Emperor Otto, Mieszko did have clear ambitions in western Pomerania, lands the German nobility, including Odo, coveted for themselves. Another factor may have been the appeals of the Polish duke's recent Volhynian enemies for an intervention. Wolin's importance also makes it a prime factor in the outbreak of hostilities. The Volhynians were rich, located at the mouth of the Oder. They were well placed for trade and had Scandinavian contacts. Having also tasted the sting of defeat and seen it done elsewhere, the Volhynians may have been angling for German overlordship themselves for their own protection, something Mieszko naturally opposed. Fortunately for the Polish ruler, just as in 967, he was well informed of any negotiations between Odo and the Volhynians, and had sufficient time to call up his own forces to meet any invasion, as well as choose the point of his intervention. It's certain Margrave Dietrich didn't personally intervene or fully muster his own forces in the Nordmark. However, his subordinate Siegfried, the father of Thietmar of Marsburg, our chief source for the battle, did join Odo, who likely mustered his force of around 3 to several thousand men. Two things that are certain is that Odo acted while his emperor was absent in far-off Italy, and that he acted alone, or rather not as part of a larger German force. This means the dispute was more personal, perhaps an adventure for his own glory, an attempt to mimic his greater relative Gero, while serving the emperor's interests in squashing a potential threat in Mieszko. As for Mieszko, we know that given the nature of the coming battle and the haste of Odo's own campaign, that he must have had good intelligence on the Margrave's doings. Unlike in 967, however, Mieszko could not summon his Přemyslid allies, given his own urgency. The very nature of the apparent haste of Odo, the absence of the emperor, and the relative sizes of the armies involved in the action of 972 suggests Odo's campaign was hastily conceived. Perhaps the Volhynians were on the verge of total defeat, and so haste was required, which meant no consultation with distant Otto. Another reason may simply have been an attempt at surprise, a lightning campaign to strike quickly at an unprepared Mieszko. As aforementioned, one source does helpfully total Mieszko's retinue at about 3,000 armoured men, though as in 967, not all his Druzhina would have mustered to battle at Cedynia, many instead guarding their lord's many strongholds, with Mieszko naturally, in addition, keeping some of his best men in reserve to respond to setbacks and other developments. However, we can safely assume the Polish Duke also summoned a sizable levy and a substantial contingent of cavalry, granting Mieszko a similar number to Odo for the coming clash. Polish scouts or intelligence likely accurately tracked Odo's movements, as Mieszko's army was already close to where the invaders would enter his lands. The stronghold of Sadinia was a frontier settlement, guarding a trade route that connected central Germany to the Piast-controlled coast. It also guarded a key crossing of the Oder. A formidable stronghold, Mieszko placed a part of his force within while awaiting the arrival of his foes. Odo meanwhile moved northeast through Palabian lands, and likely crossed the Oder via a ford a little downstream from Sadinia itself. There is no indication in the sources of any contested crossing. However, this is plausible, though given fighting with cavalry is problematic in marshy areas and around the river, the fighting may have taken place slightly forward of the crossing point. In any case, what is likely is that Mieszko's forward units were nearby, and that once Odo's forces were committed to the crossing, they struck. This phase of the battle would have been skillfully managed by Mieszko, employing the same discipline, patience and charisma of the previous engagement with the Valleti-Volhynian alliance. Another source, Bruno of Querfurt, wrote that Mieszko employed craft during the battle, suggesting he had to sufficiently convince Odo he was on the back foot. After sustaining some casualties, Mieszko ordered a withdrawal along the trade route towards Sadinia itself. Odo's forces, likely after a brief respite, moved to follow. However, given the constricted geography of the route, the Margrave's army could only move in a column toward his quarry. Marshes extended towards the river, whilst hilly terrain hemmed in the road from the opposite side. However, given they had just smashed Polish resistance and only faced a relatively small force under Mieszko, Odo perhaps felt confident in his march. Another factor in Odo's haste was likely the potential for surprising and capturing Cedynia itself. Indeed, if he could make good time, it may have been possible to seize this important stronghold without a siege, thus granting a foothold into Piast lands from which to strike further. Unfortunately for Odo, however, this was not to be. As the invaders advanced deeper along the route, Mieszko likely rallied his own men, whilst reinforcements joined him from Cedynia itself. Odo's eyes must have widened at the sight of his enemies' backs, now transformed into the angry ranks of counter-charging attackers. At the same time, Mieszko played his trump card. The stomachs of Odo's jittery ranks must have sunk like rocks, as the war cries and screams of Mieszko's hidden warriors echoed towards them, soon followed by the clash of flesh and arms. Szybor, brother of the Duke, led the attack in person, his warriors hitting the flank and rear of Odo's army. The surprise must have been complete and the carnage total. With the countercharge of Mieszko himself, the Imperial army was encircled and in a desperate fight for life and limb. The infantry clash was likely fairly equal, as Odo's foot would have largely consisted of conquered Slavic folk. As may have been expected, given their relative lack of training and armour, the Polish levy stood little chance man-to-man against armoured knights. Saxon armies had generally honed the use of the heavy knight to deadly effect, forged by countless battles over the previous decades. The humble Polish infantryman could afford little protection and would have fought with shields, spears, war axes, and bows. Yet this day they fought courageously, like beasts hemming in the Germans. No doubt too the presence of Mieszko's armoured and skilled loricati also bolstered their resolve. These mounted warriors did much to offset the imbalance against the heavy German knights, carving bloody paths into Odo's shocked ranks with their spears, battle axes, and occasional swords. The result was that what began as a triumphal march, a vain hope for glory and plunder, now descended into bloody failure for Odo and his army. Though better skilled and trained, the heavy German knights had little room to maneuver and even less time to react. While it's clear this led to many falling to the axes and spears of the Poles, it's probable many of Odo's men risked traversing the marshes only to find watery graves. Regardless of the exact manner or course of events, what is clear is that German casualties were heavy. Two men that did survive were Odo and Siegfried themselves. It's probable too that many of the less fortunate knights were merely captured rather than slain, though the fate for the common foot soldier would have been much more severe. What had begun as a superficial defeat was now revealed as a resounding Polish victory. News of Odo's defeat quickly reached Emperor Otto in Italy, and he sent urgent orders for the men to cease hostilities at the risk of forfeiting his favour. While Sadinia was certainly a triumph for the Duke, he had no desire to provoke a more dangerous unified response to any counter-invasion he could have launched. In the spring of 973, Otto returned to Saxony, and in Quedlinburg the dispute between Mieszko and Odo was judged. Unsurprisingly, the emperor sided with his own Margrave, even blaming the Polish ruler for the outbreak of hostilities, despite the fact that it was Odo who initiated the fighting. Indeed, Odo suffered little other than hurt pride as he continued to rule his province until his death in 993. Mieszko, however, was compelled to send his son, Bolesław, the future Bolesław the Brave, as security for the peace. It's likely the act, if even followed through with, was a gesture of submission. Both rulers had no appetite for war. Otto was preoccupied elsewhere and uninterested in a war to the east, whilst Mieszko would surely lose a war against all of Germany, his domain perhaps even eventually being incorporated into the empire itself, rather than just tributary to it. Bolesław's stay at the imperial court would be brief, as Otto the Great himself breathed his last soon after the conference. Mieszko's final campaign in the summer of 991 was as part of a Germano-Polish attack on the Stodderen stronghold of Brenna, later Brandenburg. With Brenna's fall, he returned to his lands, still the untamed ruler of his own domain. While much is uncertain about the 972 campaign, there is little doubt that the Battle of Cedynia marked the defining point of early Polish statehood, as important to the Polish people as Hastings to the English, or Bouvines to the French. As the first documented battle in the nation's history, it holds a special place in Polish history, down to this very day. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel, as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.